What does it say about a government that persecutes those that tell the truth? We hear so much today about anti-government as if it's a bad thing. I think that many of us hear the phrase anti-government and we envision some fringe element of society lurking in the shadows. But is anti-government really a proper description of those it is used against, who are only striving for legitimate and lawful government? When a government acts beyond the bounds of its legal character, it ceases to be legitimate. When it acts outside of the law, as we have seen recently in the Fast and Furious scandal, it is no different than any other criminal organization, with one powerful exception. It maintains the color of the illusion of legitimacy. When governments allow unlawful conduct and use the power and control of government to cover up these unlawful acts, is exposing that corruption anti-government? Our next guest knows far too well about what a government may be capable of. She was a Customs and Border Protections officer who was falsely declared a domestic terrorist and subjected to retaliation of unprecedented proportions by the Department of Homeland Security for simply doing her job. Her home was raided with a Black Hawk helicopter and a 27-man special response team. She was twice falsely arrested and imprisoned, but later exonerated and found factually innocent. National security expert Julia Davis is a producer of a historical documentary that dared to expose the truth, titled Top Priority. In spite of the government censorship and the mainstream media blackout, this is the documentary the government does not want you to see. Julia, welcome to the program. What an amazing story you have. First of all, before we talk about your film, the government had actually labeled you as a domestic terrorist. What do you say to that?
I think it's quite outrageous, and if anyone told me beforehand that something like this could happen in America, I would have never believed them. But once it happened and I started researching the history of the way the government has been treating whistleblowers, I started to see a definite pattern. And as Thomas Jefferson said, it is the duty of the patriot to protect his country from his government. And when whistleblowers try to do that, they often become targets themselves and get labeled with all kinds of names. In my case, I was a domestic terrorist.
Now, could you give our viewers a synopsis of your documentary, Top Priority? What's it all about?
It's about a little history of how I worked at the border when I worked for the Department of Homeland Security. And I was working on a special team that mainly dealt with issues regarding applicants from other than Mexican countries, and specifically it had to do with applicants from countries of special interest, which are countries with links to terrorism. And we had very specific alerts that on 4th of July, Independence Day 2004, members of Al-Qaeda were planning to penetrate the U.S. through our land borders with Mexico. And the border crossing where I worked was the San Isidro border crossing, which is the largest and busiest land border port in the world, and was specifically mentioned by radical Muslim clerics as a great point of entry to breach because of such an influx of people. And also it has a tunnel where they specifically discussed, it's actually a YouTube video from one of the radical clerics where they talked about walking across that border with a bomb and a backpack and discussing different ways of coming across. So when we had these very specific alerts for 4th of July that pinpointed that date as a date of special importance, when I came into work, I got to going through the paperwork to put it into the Homeland Security databases, which in my capacity as a supervisor was something that I was obligated to do. And I started to see that we had many entries of people from terrorist countries exactly on that date when we were expecting that Al-Qaeda would be trying to come across. We had a total of 23 people from terrorist countries that were admitted in the U.S. And that wasn't the only problem. The number itself was already alarming because we would normally get no more than 5 to 10 people in an entire month's period. Here we had 23 in a short 10-hour span. But to make matters worse, none of these people were subjected to any of the routine checks that were in place specifically for applicants from terrorist countries. They were supposed to be fingerprinted. They were supposed to be asked why they left the U.S., why they were coming back, where they were living, all these different procedures that would have taken approximately an hour per each person. None of it was done. In some of the cases, they didn't even bother fill out any of the paperwork or copy their documents that they presented to come into the United States. So when I went to the port director, I assumed that he was already informed about these suspicious entries since we were on high alert. But he wasn't informed and told me to take it to Intel. And when I go to Intel, I nearly fell down when I find a closed door. Apparently, all the Intel was given a day off so they could barbecue for 4th of July on this date of special importance. So there was no one for me to report this to. I went back to port director, and he just wanted me to turn in the paperwork to Intel, put it into their box, let them get to it when they will. Our manual, however, said that if we encountered anything that could be remotely related to terrorism, we were supposed to notify Joint Terrorism Task Force. So even though the port director didn't feel the need to do that, and I believe that was solely because they didn't want to be embarrassed to say there's no one on duty, there's no one watching the entry, and this many people were admitted on this day of heightened security alert. So when I got home that night and I was no longer under port director's orders, I took it upon myself to contact the FBI just to let them know what was going on and give them this information so that they could look into it in case an entire cell had penetrated the border. And in my mind, I wasn't blowing the whistle. I wasn't doing any such thing. I was just doing my job and also acting as a concerned American citizen to make sure that while Intel is barbecuing, nothing gets blown up within the United States by the people that were so carelessly admitted across the border. And from that point forward, my life was never the same. Every day I come into work, I would find out that I'm being investigated for one thing or another. It was always something ridiculous. For example, whether I had my cell phone with me at work or what I was doing on my unpaid leave. And it was just a campaign to get me fired for any reason whatsoever, because if they could do that, then they could say she's a bad apple, no one needs to listen to her, because look at that, we're investigating her and we're going to fire her. So that was rapidly underway. And as I later found out, what happened is port management was contacted by former Commissioner of Customs, Robert Bonner, who started asking them for any derogatory information about Julia Davis, because they were so embarrassed by the FBI finding out what Homeland Security had done on 4th of July. So they started to look for information to try to discredit me, but there wasn't any. They received a response that I was not being investigated for anything, so they decided to correct that. And within 2 weeks, I was the subject of 19 investigations. And by the time we sued Homeland Security, there were a total of 54 investigations, which they were forced to provide us with case numbers and information regarding those cases. And I was declared a domestic terrorist and had my home raided with a Black Hawk helicopter, 27-man SWAT team. And actually, they had utilized more manpower and spent more time raiding my home without a search warrant than they did on the Bin Laden's compound. And
wow,
also,
this is really a dramatic story, and it all started simply because you had a concern about people crossing the border, an increased number. You said about 23 individuals, did you say, were crossing the border?
Yes,
23 individuals from a known terrorist related nation crossing the border on the 4th of July. And why were these standard security checks, which would have taken an hour, why were they not just implemented at that moment?
I've been often wondering about that, and I think there are two options. One is someone was just absolutely derelict of their duties, but also if you look up the history of customs is the most corrupt federal agency historically, and specifically that border crossing even had a port director that was caught accepting bribes and letting people come across, illegal aliens and people with drugs. So at that point, those are the possibilities that I'm thinking might have been involved. And also there was intel that came up later that Arab nationals before that date were offering $5,000 per person for someone to let them in without scrutiny. So it's very possible that someone took them up on that offer.
Now, what does this tell you about the Department of Homeland Security itself? Here you are simply doing your job, but then you find yourself being the subject of investigations by the people you work for. What does this tell you about the agency?
It makes me think that the so-called war on terror is more of a charade, and the priority of the agency seems to be to target concerned citizens and whistleblowers, because in my case, and I'm sure in countless other cases, they sent an airplane to follow me, which they admitted on video, and can you imagine millions of dollars that were spent doing that? They had 8 agents at a time following me on foot, in vehicles, airplane, helicopter. They used OnStar to listen into what was being said inside of our car and to track our communications. So when you think about that, this can happen to anyone. If you say anything that Homeland Security doesn't like, they could utilize all of these measures simply because they would say that you are being suspected of being a radical or being a domestic terrorist. In the lawsuit filings, they were actually forced to provide some of the documents that revealed the reasoning behind why they called me a domestic terrorist. And it said plain on black and white that they consider Julia Davis to be a domestic terrorist for derogatory statements made in her filings and articles about the Department of Homeland Security. So that could clearly qualify a multitude of people to be designated domestic terrorists.
So Julia, so simply stating facts about the Department of Homeland Security in a filing, a paper filing with the agency, made them declare you a domestic terrorist.
That's what happened in my case. And they do it for a very strategic reason, because they believe that in that scenario, they are free from having to follow any laws that would may force them to follow the Constitution, because then they could use the Patriot Act. They could do warrantless searches and seizures, as they did with me, warrantless surveillance without any court supervision. So there's a number of things that they could do. So the domestic terrorist qualifications are so loose that probably 90% of the population would qualify as one if Department of Homeland Security wanted to pursue them.
Now, the film Top Priority, the director, Asif Akbar, as well as yourself and others, have had a lot of pressure put on since the actual releasing of the film. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, Asif's family owns stores, and those stores have been raided by the Department of Homeland Security and pursued in that way, and we're still subject to surveillance. I routinely post pictures of people that are driving by our home and taking pictures of us, or just hiding in the bushes taking pictures. So that continues, and then there are all kinds of electronic interruptions and a multitude of ways. And IRS is auditing all of us, of course, and IRS even audited attorneys that were involved in my civil cases where I prevailed against the Department of Homeland Security. So they are definitely applying pressure in every way possible.
Julia, I find it interesting that critics of the film do not dispute the facts of the film, only saying things like this film distracts from the core story or the film does not serve the viewer nor subject. Has anyone come out and refuted the actual facts as you've laid them out?
Absolutely not. And actually, Judge Larson, who presided over my lawsuit against the government, which details the same facts as the documentary does, said that he was amazed at what the government is not denying in my case. They cannot deny it because they have been caught red-handed. So no, no one denied a single fact, and we made sure that the documentary would show footage, a videotaped deposition, videotaped surveillance, a court document. There was, for every one of our statements, there was a document or video or audio proving that it is so. So it is essentially irrefutable, and no one is denying that all of this did happen.
Now, Julia, what's next for you? I know you have another project in the works. Can you tell us about that?
We're working on a number of projects. One of them is called Whistleblowers, The Untold Stories, which will be a TV series where we will detail stories of whistleblowers from all walks of life. And another project we're working on is called Brit. One of the witnesses in my case was Brittany Murphy and her husband, who, after stepping up and supporting my case, were also subjected to helicopter surveillance and wiretapping, as they had relayed to the Hollywood Reporter, who published it in an article, except no one believed her, and that's part of the reason why people falsely perceived her to be a drug user and a junkie, and she was not. So Brit will tell the true story of Brittany Murphy's life and the events leading to her death. And also,
sorry, did you say Brittany, her death?
Yes. Both Brittany and her husband were found dead under identical and suspicious circumstances, and actually we're working with Brittany's dead right now to finally get her remains properly tested, which they were never properly tested. Both of their deaths were just called natural without even bothering to see what caused them.
Julia, you've seen the internal workings of federal law enforcement. The majority of folks that you worked with, and many others throughout government, they do want to do a good job. They want to keep America safe. But critics say that what you're claiming is just a conspiracy theory, that there is no dark underbelly in our government, only a few mistakes by well-intentioned servants of the people. How do you respond to that?
There are definitely plenty of good, well-meaning people in our government. Unfortunately, the bad apples happen to be the ones in positions of power. And even as the administrations change and politics are played out, those heads of federal agencies and their subordinates remain unchanged. And the agencies have an entire system of dealing with their critics based on the Malik Manual, going all the way back to the Nixon administration. So it's a whole system instilled in place, and they're connected to the media to silence certain stories. They're also connected to law enforcement, where they can prosecute anyone who they select. So it's definitely not a conspiracy theory. The only conspiracy there is that on the part of the government to silence its critics.
What kind of media attention have you received other than being on this program?
I have done a few interviews on the radio, and also had written interviews, and I have encountered a strong opposition. 60 Minutes interviewed me, actually. CBS spent over 8 hours at our home doing an interview, and then just a couple of days before it was to be aired, they had it pulled, and I was quietly told, and asked not to repeat it, that someone very high up did not want it to air and was applying serious pressure to not have it aired. And the same happened previously with the big tobacco whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand, where 60 Minutes filmed this interview, but then never aired it until after the film where he was played by Russell Crowe came out. Only then did they air the interview. So there's definitely been a pushback and the blackout by the mainstream media. They do not want this story told because it connects to their friends in high places.